Hey Bible lovers, I'm Tim Nichols, and I'm here to bring you your Nichols Word. Today we're going to talk about 5 reasons why I am not King James only. So let's start off with number 5, and that is because the KJV has words that don't mean today what they meant 400 years ago. Now, Mark Ward refers to these words as false friends. I'm going to give you an example of one. Suffer the children and let them come. Now, a lot of times with a false friend, you can actually figure out what it means with the context, but there are times where it's difficult in order to do that. But suffer the children and let them come. Suffer today for us means to endure hardship or to have something difficult happen to you. But back then, suffer also meant to allow. So allow the children to come. Study to show thyself approved is another one where the word study actually means to be diligent as well as study. So context sometimes will help us, but sometimes it also won't. Why not just go ahead and use a more modern translation where that word is replaced with an equivalent that has today's meaning. For example, Jesus said in the King James that when you pray, go into your closet. Well, today a closet means a place where you hang your coat or a little place that's for storage. Well, back then, a closet meant a small room or a private room. So more of your translations today say when you pray, go into a private room, go into a small room, or like the New King James says, go into your room. So those are just some examples of words that aren't necessarily archaic. In other words, they are still in use, but they don't mean what they used to mean. Now let's go with number 4, which I think is a little bit related to the 5th reason, and that is we need translations in a language that we can understand today. In other words, we need a Bible in a translation that can be understood by someone with a moderate to average education level. We don't want someone to have a college degree in order to be able to understand the Bible. We want to be able to read it to our children, and we want our teenagers to be able to read it. We want our young adults to be able to read it, and we want those of an average education to be able to read the Word. And the King James, while it is beautiful English, and it is a beautiful translation, this is not a knock against the King James. I love the King James, but for some, it is very difficult to read. I actually find it very easy to listen to. If someone else is reading it to me, then I find myself able to easily understand it. But when I'm reading it, that's when I tend to struggle. So the King James is a bit archaic in the sense that it's not unreadable, but it is very difficult to understand in some cases. Number 3, and this is a reason you hear me say a lot, is I believe that reading multiple translations is the path to understanding the Bible better. Sometimes we need that different rendering from a different translation in order to get us to more fully understand it. Sometimes we need something more on the dynamic side or the more phrase for phrase or thought for thought side, and sometimes we need it in that more word for word side in order to be able to understand it a little better, and we need a wider range of translations in order to be able to do that. The King James is in that more word for word style, so we're going to need something to kind of offset it. In addition to the fact that we need more modern English, we also need different translation philosophies in order to really be able to successfully understand the Word of God sometimes. Also in that same vein, sometimes when we read a different translation and it renders differently than we're used to, and it kind of jars us into studying a little deeper, and I always think that's a good thing. So now let's go ahead and talk about reason number 2, and that is I believe the discovery of older manuscripts such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the older Greek manuscripts that we've discovered since the dawn of the King James, to include the Codex Sinaiticus and beyond, even non-biblical text from the Mesopotamian world and the Ugaritic world that gives us a better understanding of some of these strange poetic phrases in, say, for example, the Psalms and beyond. We used to not fully understand what it meant, but now that we have these records of these nations and the gods that they serve, now we understand why God took with such great severity some of the different pagan practices that today we wouldn't even know are pagan. That gives us further context of the world around Israel. We even have more information now on the Leviathan and many of the other spirit entities that we would not have had if it weren't for these texts. And I think it's important, if they're not included in the translation, at least include them in the footnotes, which leads me to my number 1 reason why I am not King James only, and that is that the King James translators themselves were not King James only. In their translator to the readers, I'm going to read you a few things that they said themselves. Number 1, they acknowledged other translations, and they said they weren't trying to make a bad translation good, but a good translation better. Also, they acknowledged that translations need to be updated, and that was the effort they were making. They didn't see their work as a replacement for Bible translation, but as a broader part of the tradition and history of the work of translation into English. They expected the King James to be updated. They expected new translations to be brought on the horizon. They didn't expect that the King James would be the only translation in English for the rest of human history. Also, they stated in this translator to the readers that they used multiple textual sources to include the Vulgate, German, Greek, and beyond. So there's Latin influence in there. There's even influence from the Tyndale and previous English translations to include the Douay-Rheims. So they certainly were not King James only. And then lastly, they acknowledged they needed textual footnotes to acknowledge translation difficulties. So yes, the King James is an amazing translation. Yes, I believe the King James is still readable and useful today in most cases. That's why I love the Humble Lamb Lion that actually offers the definition for archaic words at the bottom instead of translator footnotes. I definitely believe that's a better use of the space because a lot of those words don't mean what they used to anymore, and a lot of those words aren't in use anymore, so you need a completely different word in its spot because that's a word that is just absolutely no longer in use. For example, concupiscence. Who uses that word anymore, but it actually means like a strong sexual desire or a lust. So while I believe that the King James is a beautiful translation, there is nothing that matches its beauty in the English language, but just because it's beautiful does not mean that it's readable all the time. And I believe that other translations need to be brought into the spectrum of your reading experience. And for those that are in the King James only movement, I believe that they are borderline cultish in their beliefs, and ultimately it's not founded on factual evidence. It's founded on raw emotion. Now, whether you believe the Textus Receptus is the true Word of God and you believe that the critical apparatus is corrupted, that's a little bit of a different argument because there are a couple of modern translations today that use the Textus Receptus as their base. For example, the New King James and the MEV. There are also some translations that use the majority text, which is very similar to the Textus Receptus, and that would be the WEB and the NJV, for example. But this argument that the Textus Receptus is better than the critical apparatus, that's probably for a separate video. As a matter of fact, I've had that argument. I'll put that video on the end screen so that you can check that out. God bless you. Keep calm. Jesus on. This is your Nicholsworth.